This is Judge Dredd. I am the law. Judgment time.
Welcome to the culmination of 44 years of misery. The official Dave Pybers podcast. Life is a hideous thing.
Just to sort of start to change into the comic world.
Okay, go for it.
Obviously, there's been attachments to you as an anti-superhero kind of guy, anti-establishment, anti-war, a lot of things. The other day I watched that remake of Dredd.
Yeah.
And obviously for me personally, Judge Dredd was always a bit of an anti-hero anyway, because he wasn't really a hero, he was just a policeman who had kind of a cool angle on things. But did you see that film?
I did, yeah.
What do you think?
I don't think either film were successful commercially, but I think it was this one was more successful than its predecessor. So in other words, it responded to fandom and what the fans wanted. I think the fact that it wasn't a commercial success raises questions, and I think the problems with it are, in other words, the reason it wasn't a success, it should have been a bigger success. I think the reason it wasn't is perhaps reflects my own reservations on it, which would be to do with the nature of Dredd, the nature of fantasy, the tricky role of comedy, because after all, when we kicked off Dredd, the template had a strong comedy element. If you think back to Walter the Wobot, if you think back to Dredd's Italian landlady worrying about him being out on the streets, all sorts of very witty and very clever stories by John Wagner. And what we have here is a kind of Dirty Harry, but I'm not sure whether the audience would consciously be aware of it, but there were other ingredients in the original mix of Dredd which are not there now. Certainly not there in the movie. And I think the absence of those elements played a role in why it wasn't a bigger success. It kept the fans happy, and that in itself is a dilemma. There was a rule that a publisher said to me before 2000 AD was launched, when I was agonizing over this, because the first time I'd really had anything to do with fans. I'd produced other comics, and I'd never met anybody. I just got all this reader feedback, so I knew what the readers wanted. And suddenly I was interacting with fans, and I didn't know whether I should listen to their voices or not. So I spoke to the publisher and I said, well, what do you think about this? And he said, look, go for your mainstream audience. The fans will follow. They'll curse, they'll complain, they'll moan, they'll criticize, but they will follow. Don't do it the other way round. And that is profound advice, and he's absolutely right. Look at Watchmen. The director does everything right because he wants to keep the fans happy. That's not enough. There's not enough of them. You've got to keep, that ordinary guy in the street who's never heard of Watchmen or never heard of Judge Dredd. What's it got to do with me? You've got to think, how do I attract that person? And it's part of a different kind of elitism to say they don't matter. Yes, they do. When every story I write, I try as best I possibly can to say, if somebody who'd never read one of my stories before picked this up, could he understand what I'm saying? It's not always possible to follow that perfectly, but as best I can, I try to do that. So someone can pick up a comic and they get it. And that does happen, not with all my stories, because the artwork plays a role as well. And as you can imagine, a lot of the artists I work with, their styles are wonderful, but they are not necessarily accessible to someone who's never picked up a comic before. Charlie's War, of course, being a case where French kids get it instantly. They just open the book, and I've watched them, and they start reading it, just something to do while they're waiting for dad at, some convention or something. And then you see them turning the second page and the third, which I thoroughly approve of. I really approve of kids reading comics for free. I always avoid eye contact with them so they carry on reading, and then they buy it. Brilliant result. So I think somewhere along the way, fandom as its voice is a little too strong, or rather the voice of the mainstream is not strong enough, because not many other people in the business subscribe to the same view as me, with such notable exceptions as Kevin O'Neill, who I always love his description of graphic novels, the term that the middle classes prefer. He describes them as fat comic books.
And I did see in Waterstones just this week the Charlie's War, what was it, the really big, thick version of it, and that was really nice.
Where I think 3 volumes are collected together, Yeah,
and it was really nice to see that, because it was actually in the war section and not the comic section.
And it's a cheaper edition, which I thoroughly approve of. Again, I mean, if you look at the Charlie's War collected volumes, they're great, and they look really classy, and I'm so delighted with that. But the French editions have bright primary colours on them, so they attract kids. Now, the Charlie's War covers wouldn't necessarily attract a kid unless they're really into war in the first place. If you're going to pull in a 12 or a 13-year-old, you need a different type of cover. And my loyalty and my affection is always towards mainstream kids. They're the audience I really want to hook,
I mean, I'm not a massive fan of these new Hollywood superhero films. I don't see the point of them, and I do debate with some of my friends who are very into the lineage of how it all works, X-Men and all that. I just don't get it. But when I watched Dredd, it was a bit of a double-edged sword for me, because I was watching one of these modern kind of films. I'm not into modern film at all. I thought aesthetically it looked nice, and the violence in it was pretty close to what I expected a modern film to portray. And the actor was brilliantly cast as Dredd. I mean, he got the right jaw and everything. Do you think so? I thought he was a little bit too skinny. Well, I suppose it depends whether you're going for McMahon's Dredd, who often was very skinny. Yeah, right. He was a bit more chunky, yeah. But like you say, the characters were very undeveloped, I felt. At the end, I didn't really know Judge Anderson, and I didn't really know Judge Dredd even. They just did this thing, and that was that. It looked nice, but it didn't really develop them as... There was no humour in it. There was no real conversation between them. It was just, you're the rookie, now do what I tell you. Maybe I didn't get it. I don't know. I'm like I say. I think it's that's a fair reaction. I think the other elements in it outweighed it for fans. The fans really did like that movie. It was playing to that gallery, but it wasn't playing to the gallery of ordinary people who, they like science fiction, they may have heard of Judge Dredd, so they give it a try. It's got to have that extra factor. And it's so tough. It's so tough. I mean, I have so much sympathy with all the people who made that happen, because, they've got the legacy of the previous Dredd film, which has very separate, very different problems attached to it. And so they're trying to keep some distance from that. It's a tough one. I mean, it's so tough, yeah. Dirty Harry, when I was young, became a hero of mine, which is terrible because I was 10. And you're going to school with this really horrible attitude of, like, I don't know, it was kind of odd, but I kind of attained that more into Judge Dredd's character in the movie. I wanted him to, at the end, throw Judge Anderson's badge in the trash and say, she's failed. And I would have respected him more. I don't know why. I wanted him to be tougher. I wanted him to be more brutal. We have Hollywood and cinema, it is very conservative today. You're talking about modern films, so I'm assuming you have an affection for much older films. Now, if you go back to some of the films, which actually I didn't even watch at the time, but I was influenced by anyway, because I think people were talking about them, failure was okay. So a very good example of that is The Loneliness of the Long-Distance Runner. This Borstal boy who deliberately fails to screw up the establishment. I mean, what a wonderful message. Could that be made today? Most definitely not. Because, they don't want that kind of message to get out. But I think that's a great celebration of working class characters and values to say, you don't necessarily have to join the rat race. And you imagine if you were, I don't know what effect it had on you when you were 10 if you'd seen that film. And of course, the disapproval of the establishment would be this is giving kids unhealthy attitudes. Of course, it wasn't aimed at kids. It was aimed at, an older audience. It was probably an X certificate, or I don't know, whatever they called it then, 16, 17. But it's so good to see a really well thought out story on the screen like that, The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner, and saying,
no, you don't have to join the rat race. You don't have to become a yuppie or whatever. And in a similar way, if it was appropriate for Dredd to fail. In other words, failure is something that's worth exploring in drama without it becoming art house, if you like.
Another one, after analysing it, became Quint in Jaws. Out of the three characters on the boat, you would like to think that, you know, Chief Brody was the nice guy who was just dragged into a complete mess, and the other two were just bitching about how to catch his shark. But Quint's character, for me, he also had an influence on me as a child, if I admit it. He was awkward. He knew what he wanted to do. He knew how to do it, and he was a dirty player. He'd get what he needed to do, and I don't know whether that's had any influence on me. I'm sure some people would argue that.
I think movie characters, whether we call them heroes or not, they will have a profound influence. Because what does it come down to? We're looking for role models in life. We may not be aware of it consciously, but that's why we listen to music, why we watch certain dramas. We're trying to think, who do we identify with? Who would we like to be like?
Yeah.
So that's why, the very early Spider-Mans were so compelling, because, it could be an ordinary kid. Probably these days, after it's been given a reworking and everything, it's a different animal now. But back then, he was just an ordinary kid. He got the costume wrong. He put it in the washing machine and it shrank, and all those kind of problems that when you're 14, 15, 16 are very much part of your reality. So, yeah, I mean, you see Jaws, it's natural to want to identify with the principal characters, and they are going to have a profound effect on us. We're crying out for role models, and that's why it's so disturbing that there aren't, I don't know about healthy role models, but counterculture role models, shall we say.
I think Dirty Harry was just all about the gun, really. The 44. But
it's great. It's a glamorization of violence, but it works, and nothing wrong with that. And I think what I try to do in action comic, I try to take that and work it into my my whole sort of, if you like, class issues, because you had a character called Dredger who was very clearly based on Dirty Harry. And I did something that's actually, for me, it was very profound and still is profound, because I do the same thing with Defoe. You have a working class hero with an upper class sidekick. So Dredger, his sidekick, is a guy from public school, Oxford, but he's the hero. And we need that, because the majority of fictional heroes are invariably middle class or even upper middle class. Whether it's Sherlock Holmes, James Bond, Biggles, whoever. There's nothing wrong with those characters, that's fine, but we do need an alternative. And it doesn't seem to bother anybody apart from me. I think it bothers people outside comics. I think inside comics we become rather a sedate media, I'm afraid.
Another thing I noticed, you seem to be a great platform for artists to emerge, like, breaking artists. Like Simon Bisley, when he first started doing the ABC Warriors, I was only maybe 17 or 18, and I loved his black and white artwork initially, and then he went on to do colour stuff with Slain. Now, one of my favourite bands of the time, I mentioned this in episode 1, was the Misfits. They broke up and a new band started from the ashes of that, Danzig, and they used Simon...
Wow.
Yeah, they used Simon Bisley for a couple of album covers, so that must have been influenced from the same period that I got influenced from.
And he did his own comics as well, Danzig.
Verotic, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, the next episode I might be interviewing their bass player, Eerie Von, and so I'm going to ask him, were they into that kind of stuff, which all kind of came from your writing. It's all kind of links up with that, so going to be interested to see what he's going to reveal from sort of using the artists that you were championing at the time, pushing into, I don't know if you got a choice of that. I don't know. I think nowadays Clint Lanley is probably the best. Yeah. His artwork is fucking unbelievable. I can't believe he.
I'm so pleased you said that. I will pass that on to him, because he's always working. He rarely surfaces. I think, and so I sort of think, I hope he's okay. So yeah. I will pass on to him that you love his stuff. In the case of Simon, it wasn't that difficult to get him in. The guy's a genius. How difficult is it to get a genius? Doors will open for any genius. But there was a little a little hesitation, but for the most part, it was, all systems go. Other really talented artists, very occasionally, there would be a bit of resistance, usually for very questionable reasons. Glenn Fabry, for example. The minute I saw Glenn Fabry's artwork, my God, another genius, but there was a little bit of difficulty, which I think I kind of overrode in my somewhat abrasive manner, which perhaps explains why I'm known as the godfather of British comics. But I mean, how else do you react to it? I mean, as a musician, along comes a really talented guy, and if there's resistance to that person from within the industry, I'm sure your reaction you'd be pretty pissed off. Do you know what I mean? It's like, hey, the guy's really talented. Come on, he's the next Jimi Hendrix, whatever it is. So that was my reaction. Here is this guy, Glenn Fabry. Don't piss about. Give him some work. And it's still difficult to get new artists in. And I still continue to encourage new artists. I don't have anywhere near as much clout as I used to have, but I do my best.
I see you actually have worked with Kev Walker.
Yeah.
And I sent him a message. He actually read it and wrote me back. We haven't connected yet because, like you say, I think they've become so busy. They've become like a bit of a recluse. Unfortunately,
Probably just as bad in the music industry, but it's quite poorly paid, the world of comics. So you have to keep your head down a lot of the time. So yeah, that will probably be, that's one solution to things, is to work every hour imaginable. It's not entirely healthy. I think that, you have to find other solutions. There are other solutions to the problem, but it's not easy.
Yeah, I do remember doing my college work experience with Kev, and a lot of it was deadline driven. He was, for 2 weeks, just head down. One day his black ink of his pens ran out, and because I was a young student, I had a fresh set of pens. He borrowed mine and did one page of Rogue Trooper with it.
I feel like an intern or a experience with Kev, yeah?
Well, I was doing a graphic design course, which I hated. I wasn't a graphic designer at all. Ironically, becoming a graphic designer, doing lots of artwork for, not artwork, but layouts for album covers. And I even commissioned Dave McKean's first ever album cover.
Wow!
And I paid him £200 for an album cover, and then he went on to do the Rolling Stones and Tori Amos and, lots of massive bands. So I got him first. I was maybe 21.
I'm thrilled to hear that.
I've never had any correspondence with him. I'm sure he remembers them days quite funnily, because he was trying to get into that scene. Kev actually did a couple of album covers for us too. Whether he looks on that period as the best, because he was doing it as a favour for us, really, because he was a local artist. He was very good. Did you have any interest in H.P. Lovecraft before you got into writing?
No, not really. No, I didn't even have any particular interest in science fiction. I mean, I read science fiction, but I had no great drive on it until starting to create 2000 AD. But H.P. Lovecraft, because it had such a strong following, I really looked at, what made that work. I've adapted the odd H.P. Lovecraft story and things like that. But I admire that brooding atmosphere. And Clint Langley is a huge fan of H.P. Lovecraft. But I think my particular work and my particular audience is slightly different to the Lovecraft audience. So I would actually like to do a horror story, more horror stories. I'd like to do a horror comic and so on. It give me a great excuse to reread all those stories and actually see what made them work. Yeah.
Well, I did go back and read a few of them recently, and they are quite undeveloped. I mean, he wasn't published in his lifetime as we know publishing today. He was very underground. I think that's better because he's kind of like more expressive in his own little mind. It builds a great world for us to then explore, whereas as opposed to being a commercial entity, he didn't really give a shit about all that at the time. I don't know if you were into Star Wars when it first came out. Do you remember when it first came out, Star Wars?
I do indeed, yeah. Not especially. It had quite a lot of significance for me, though, because we knew Star Wars was coming out, and therefore 2000 AD was designed to take account of the fact that science fiction was going to be big. And previously it had not. It had a very checkered history, and a lot of things had not worked. I mean, if you think today, I mean, there might be lots of superhero films out there, but there isn't the same emphasis on science fiction movies. So it was a very risky thing to do. When Star Wars actually came out, maybe a few months after 2000 AD, we actually lost some readers because I think they thought, right, here's something that's a little bit more, I think, quite middle of the road by comparison with 2000 AD, which had a very subversive quality to it right from the very beginning. I mean, my aim was to subvert then and now. I haven't changed. So we actually lost a few readers, although I probably, in the fullness of time, it probably all balanced out. Clearly, Robusters with Rojaws and Hammerstein are influenced by the two robots in Star Wars. That aside, no, I think 2000 AD run parallel with it rather than crossing over into it. I can't think offhand of any 2000 AD stories that had a strong Star Wars influence. It doesn't turn into comics too well. Obviously when they do those, but there's certain things, spaceships and things. You need the right artist, and you need a certain flavour to it to get it right.
Yeah.
They got it right on Star Wars, but hard to create the right kind of space opera there.
There's a bit of an observation with the comics, because I remember when Star Wars initially first came out, you could buy the comics in the I think it was the first 12 episodes was the movie, and you could buy it before the film came out, not in one block. You had to buy it weekly, and so you could basically watch the film before you actually saw it on the screen. Now this new one's coming out end of this year apparently. I doubt if they're going to release it in 12 parts as a comic beforehand, because the fans will just slate it. They'll know exactly what's going to happen. It'll kill it. So I don't know whether that's the same. It's like things have changed. They want to keep the surprise, get the cues outside the cinema, and then hit them in one go. I guess their secret weapon is the big screen.
The other thing to remember is that Star Wars, before it came out and was such a colossal hit, was quite a fragile product. In other words, no one knew how big a hit it was going to be. And the evidence for this is as follows, that I think must have been before it actually came out. The poster rights to Star Wars were available for peanuts. And Kevin O'Neill went to the publisher of 2000 AD at IPC Magazines and said, look, we can pick up the poster rights to Star Wars and IPC can produce these posters. And the publisher turned Kevin down. Wow. Can you imagine that? Turning down the poster rights to Star Wars. But what that also tells you is that they obviously felt quite fragile, whoever was controlling the merchandising on Star Wars, that they were prepared to release the poster rights for peanuts. In other words, they didn't know how it was going to go. And these are the opportunities for an entrepreneur. Today, of course, it's so heavily governed because, of course, it's such a massive franchise. And I think that probably explains why you were able to read the Marvel Comics version of Star Wars ahead of the film, because they were really pumping it out there. They needed all the help they could get. Obviously, Marvel must have had quite good perception to see, hey, it's got all these stars in it. Was it Alec Guinness and so on, and Harrison Ford, I think, had been in several movies. So it was great that Marvel had gone for it. But of course, Marvel then wasn't as big an entity as it is now. So that's never going to happen again in quite that way.
I think I think they've actually released some like bubblegum cards of the new one they're meant to look like the vintage ones that I still have as a kid. That's how in the playground we were communicating this film through you'd go to the shop and you buy a pack of bubblegum cards. You get maybe 8 or 10 cards, and that's how it wasn't all the movie in order, it was just random pictures, and you'd look at these cards and think, what the fuck, I've never seen like robots, I've never seen this spaceship. I do remember
you've got 80. How many would you get in one piece of bubble gum? How many cards?
I think it was 7 or 8.
Well, you were the lucky one, because in my day, I was a bubblegum card collector. You got one card and one piece of this ghastly pink rubbish.
For the record, I never ate that bubble gum. I always give it away.
I fear I did. And so I was into things like Chesley Bonastelli, if that's how you pronounce his name, Conquest of Space. Which so I know exactly that feeling you get with a bubblegum card, where you see these incredible images, with fully painted artwork. So and in the case of Star Wars, I imagine it's a still from the film. But yeah, that must have been really exciting. I mean, I don't know what it is about bubblegum cards. I haven't carried it through into adulthood, which I'm kind of quite pleased about. I haven't got one of these, lofts full of memorabilia, but I was rabid as a cigarette card collector, bubblegum card collector. So I can really resonate with what you're saying.
Yeah, I say I've still got my cards. That's a lie. All my cards, I think, because I had 3 brothers, were destroyed somewhere along the line over a tit for tat over some toys. But I have managed to pick up the full collection quite cheap back in the 90s, and I've still got them. And they're kind of like weird to look at, because I do remember my granddad. He passed away in 1978, just before I probably saw the film for the first time. But I remember sitting with him looking at the cards, and he was looking at these cards thinking, what the hell are kids getting into these days? As a 15-year-old boy, he probably saw very different things to what I was looking at as an 8-year-old. It was a shame that he never got to see the joy it brought us as kids, because I think 2001 was out at the time, and maybe Moonraker, the James Bond film. That was about as sci-fi as you could get next to Wizard of Oz. It was pretty shit.
There were other films out there, but they were they didn't get the same kind of coverage. There was Rollerball.
Yeah, I remember that.
Which I think was excellent. There was Logan's Run, which I think was quite disappointing. I didn't like Logan's Run very much personally. And Damnation Alley was out. But that was more like a B-movie almost. Soylent Green and so on. But they were relatively limited, in terms of, and of course you may not have been able to see them as a kid because they may have had the wrong certificate on them.
Yeah, I think Planet of the Apes was borderline adult.
Yeah, they let you in. Yeah, and video hadn't arrived to get around that problem.
Well,
which of course is one of the reasons why comics did so well, because there I was producing material which kids could not otherwise get hold of.
Yeah, I had a dad who had a bit of a weird sense of humour, where he'd take me and my older brother to see movies like Jaws, and just to see what had happened, because he'd seen it the week before.
God.
And then he'd sit us down, and I never got in a bath for another 20 years. Thank you, Dad. It's true. It had a profound effect on you. And obviously when the videos came out, he'd hire videos for 2 weeks. You couldn't hire them for a day. You had to hire them as blocks. And obviously when they went out shopping, you'd dig out what video he'd got, and it was like The Exorcist or Dawn of the Dead, and you watch it, and then when they came back, you'd just be sitting there white, scared to death, and like, what's wrong with you? And I'm like, nothing. You change your life, watching The Exorcist at maybe 12 years old. I
can remember doing the same thing, keeping all that kind of thing on high shelves away from my kids, books and videos. But of course, if you're out, they get the stepladder out and up they go. And
they'll find everything. I mean,
the only security is a Chubb safe, I think. Anything other than that, forget it.
And then we blow that open anyway, eventually. So yeah, thanks, Pat.
If I can't think of anything I've said that...
It's dodgy.
Oh my God, why did I say that?
Yeah.
No, I can't think of anything. I'm very comfortable with our conversation. It's been very enjoyable. And we must meet up in Ipswich one day soon.
Yeah, just let me know when you're free, mate. I'm around.
I will.
I don't go far. So, thanks, Pat. So, hope you enjoyed part 2. I had some very positive news recently surrounding the future of the podcast. And thanks again for all the comments, good and bad. It's all appreciated. Thanks for listening. Cheers, guys.